Qing's Prose Riverside, in the quiet river water, the reflection of Shaojin Bridge floated carefully, not daring to move, for fear that the ripples would disturb these three upright words. My Tianzai boat is moored lazily by the bridge. The hull is very worn out, just like an old and weak gross price, panting and squatting under the wall to bask in the sun. It was rare for me to see him braid his hair in the morning and let it hang down his back, without calling the police. Then my grandmother took out a set of half-worn Yuanxi Qigong woolen coats and trousers, handed them to him solemnly, and warned him, "Please don't lose it again. Come back to me tonight, I'll wear it for you next time." He hummed a few times and happily took the pants, but Grandma was even more worried. She wanted to say something louder, but she was afraid it would be useless. In the end, she sighed resignedly. After Mao had finished his meal, he tied a tattered blue homespun apron around his waist. Then his grandmother became anxious again. "Mao, what's going on here? You're not going to pick grain today. Do you want this apron?" But Mao Gai replied impatiently, "Dress better." Grandma couldn't object after hearing this. She just told him to take it off as soon as the ship arrived. Don't wear it to the funeral house, because Grandpa he was the distinguished guest they invited to order the meal. He had to be decent as a follower today. Before he finished speaking, he had already picked up an oar and started walking away with his hat in hand. He looked confident and energetic today. There is enough wine and meat for him at noon. Why are you still ignoring you? So my grandmother had no choice but to scold him behind his back. This greedy old guy. After a while, my grandfather also dressed up. Black satin boots, white cloth socks. My grandfather never wore silk stockings, gauze socks or wool socks, and a bronzing silk robe. The mantle on top was very modern, made of Yuanxi genuine Chinese silk geese. The fifth aunt scented, saying it was softer than Hangzhou satin and more comfortable to wear. But later, my grandfather felt that it was too thin, so he put on a black dragon wool vest under it, although it was not cheap. Fortunately, no one would see it, because my grandfather had always been very reserved. Even if people asked him repeatedly to widen his mantle when he entered the house, he would not agree. When everything was ready, Grandma suddenly asked in a panic, "Do you want to wear a belt?" She was afraid that he would catch a cold, but my grandfather pondered for a while and only shook his head and said, "No need." He seemed a little afraid of trouble. Grandma didn't dare to ask any more questions, so she handed him a bright reddish bamboo cane and asked me to follow him with his white copper hookah pipe. On the way, I carefully held my grandfather's hookah pipe and tried to say something, but I felt embarrassed to say it to him. My grandfather looked very kind. He always looked up and smiled at the sky. The sky was high, with a few wisps of white clouds floating like gossamers. The sun was faintly scattered, and the millet in the field was golden yellow. The rice stalks looked a little withered and tired, like those who were overtired. The pregnant woman looks haggard, but with a kind of joy, which makes people believe that she can still hold on, and they will not worry too much about her. But they can't help but sigh. It was still green a while ago. My grandfather spoke slowly, as if he was happy, but also seemed regretful. I followed him inexplicably, and I just wanted to find Mao Duo. Ask him. You should be somewhat sure. Mao was sitting on the bridge railing, holding a short dry pipe in his mouth, and was alone in a leisurely trance. When he saw my grandfather and I coming over, he stuffed the pipe into his arms. It turned out that it had not been lit. "Mao," my grandfather called out as he stood by the river, picked up the bamboo sticks in one hand and pointed at the farm boat. The bamboo cane was dismantled from the mountain at my home. The thickness is evenly matched. The root joints are dense, and it is slightly curved. It looks like a natural crutch. My grandfather cherished it very much and stroked it with his hands from time to time. Over time, it became red and smooth. He was always with it, holding it in his hand when he walked, and letting it rest next to him when he sat or lying down. But he said that after my grandfather called out to him, Mao didn't dare to stay anymore. He hurried to the shore and jumped to the boat. "Be careful." I couldn't help but shout out along with my grandfather, but it was too late. The hull of the boat was rolling around, and even the quiet river water had to frown continuously. Finally, it destroyed the reflection of Shaojin Bridge, which had a straight door. Needless to say, the words cannot be clearly seen. It wasn't until Mao Huo stood firm on the stern of the boat with the oar, while extending his other hand to help my grandfather, that my grandfather didn't move, looked at me carefully, then turned around and told me not to move, and then he took care of himself. Step into the cabin. I felt very sad because I couldn't go with them to the family's funeral. I just hoped that they could bring me some fruits and peanuts when they came back. Mao, I often heard my grandmother whispering to him when she was leaving, handing him a white earthen cloth handkerchief, wrap up the leftover fruits and peanuts from the master's banquet and bring them back. Ah, King Hua is waiting for you. So Mao Hua hummed twice. I was very suspicious that he didn't understand. Then I wanted to say it again, but my grandmother stopped me by waving her hand. I was afraid that my grandfather would listen inside. My grandfather always gave only 40 cents as a gift for weddings and funerals, regardless of whether he was close or distant. He asked my grandmother to wrap it up in a piece of red paper and give it away. He would never ask for a return gift, and if possible, would not rush away easily, have a wedding banquet or bring a meal. But Grandma was not like that. She wished she could take all of us grandchildren with her, and she also wished she could bring back all the leftovers. However, my grandfather would never allow her to do this, so she had to quietly take care of Mao Gai. Mao Huo is good at everything else, but he can't be considered stupid when it comes to food. Look! He has carefully put the white cloth into his arms, ready to bring us a big bag, fruits, peanuts and all unexpected good things. But today I didn't seem to see my grandmother giving him instructions, nor did I see him put any white cloth or other handkerchiefs into his arms. What should I do? I couldn't ask again. I had to quickly give the copper-nickel hookah pipe to my grandfather. I remember very clearly how I sat silently in the kitchen after returning home that day. My grandmother ignored me when she asked me if I wanted some baby cakes to eat. My neighbor Yu Xiang'u asked me to come with her to make cakes but ignored her. Finally, I had to conclude that I was innocent. So my grandmother pushed me into bed half coaxed and half forced. While peeling walnuts and almonds for me to eat, she told me the story of Mao Bao. This guy is really a good person. Grandma sighed softly and said, he just has no sense of propriety. Last time I asked him to send a New Year gift to your grandma's house, but your grandma gave him too much wine, and he fell asleep on the way back. He passed out drunk in the pavilion. Later, he saw an old beggar without any clothes. He took advantage of his body heat when he was drunk and gave the old beggar a silk cotton jacket that your grandfather had given him not long ago, and also gave him the one that your grandmother had given him. I also gave away my money and money. This fool came home and shivered with cold. He hid in the stove hole without saying a word, which really made me laugh to death. From then on, I refused to give him pants again. He just said it was lent to him. Mao Gai is such a strange person. No one knows about his family background, and he himself has never mentioned it. Fortunately, there is no need for people to study it. He appeared more than 30 years ago. At that time, my grandfather was newly elected, and the family felt that there were not enough servants. So he was introduced by a boss who supported a firewood boat and brought him to my house. He has a very strong body, my grandmother said, but he looks like a gourd without a mouth. I think he is a little stupid, but your grandfather said that as long as you have the strength to do long-term work, it is better to be honest. His inability to speak was really surprising. One time my grandmother was ill and my mother sent him to visit her. He ran to her house and sat down on the stepstone, taking out a cigarette pipe to hold it. Go for most of the day. My grandma couldn't help it anymore, so she personally helped him out to the steps and asked him if the young lady had anything to say. After thinking hard for a long time, he replied, No. My grandmother smiled and said, Didn't you even ask me if my illness is getting better? Then he suddenly understood and couldn't help but smile. He responded, Yes, there is such a saying. There is such a saying, which made everyone in Grandma's family laugh. And it wasn't just this time that people laughed at him. It is said that during the revolution of 1911, the military and police in the city were busy cutting the pigtails of stubborn people. Mao didn't pay attention to current affairs, so naturally he didn't know about it. And people didn't rush to tell him. Once my grandfather sent him to the city to deliver a message, At the city gate, he met a group of people who insisted on cutting his braids. He immediately turned as red as pig liver and thought angrily, "I can't even keep my braids. Why are you still alive?" So he broke away and jumped towards the heart of the river. When he was rescued, he was already frothing at the mouth. It happened that the group of people were determined not to achieve their goal and still helped him. When he was dripping with water, he cut off his braid. So he was heartbroken and vowed never to go to the city. When he returned to the country, he grew his hair longer. So someone asked him, "Do you also want to be loyal to the emperor?" But he shook his head inexplicably and said, "I don't know the emperor." "Then why do you have to have braids?" This, he began to despise. That living person still doesn't know the benefits of having pigtails. "Don't I want to wear a hat?" Without the pigtails coiled around the head, the hat can be worn securely. It turns out that for this reason, he tried desperately to keep the pigtails. Everyone laughs at his stupidity, but he doesn't care. I saw him always wearing this police hat shirtless, either carrying heavy grain loads, harvesting rice, or doing menial work in the fields. He was panting all the time, but he was unwilling to rest. Sometimes my grandmother couldn't bear to look at him and said to him, "You should take a rest. Why are you fighting for your life?" Not only was he not grateful after hearing this, but he couldn't help but said angrily as if he had been insulted. "Who said I don't have strength? Even though I am old, I am still able to work. Can such a young man compare to me?" Grandma had no choice but to sigh and said, "You stupid cow who doesn't know how to praise." He winked and told me to tell his grandfather to go. Because his grandfather came out, he didn't dare to disobey the old man, so he had to sit down and rest with his mouth full. When he wasn't wearing a hat, he would tie his braids together to make them look neater. I was afraid to see his face. Sometimes he would carry grain into the barn while I was playing in the barn. He would yell angrily, "Get out of here! Get out!" I was so angry that I stamped my feet and cursed. "Old man, I don't want you to talk." But he didn't dare not to get out of the way, otherwise it would be no fun if he knocked him down. "Get out!" He poured the grain on the ground and turned around to drive me away. I had to walk out of the barn bitterly, but I was unwilling to go down. I just looked at the door. God, retribution. What is he coughing? He's coughing. It was very heavy and continuous, and the veins on my forehead were bulging, as if my throat was in pain. I couldn't help but put 2 or 3 fingers in to pinch it, and all I vomited out was blood. Oh my God! He seemed to be frightened, and hurriedly wiped it with his straw-shoed feet. The blood on his fingers was smeared on the wall of the warehouse, horizontally and vertically. He turned around in surprise and saw that I was still looking round. So he warned me again. "I'm going to tell my grandparents that I have to do some work, but they won't agree if they find out." I hesitated about this for a long time, and one day I finally told my grandmother quietly. My grandmother told my grandfather that from then on, my grandfather would not allow him to do anything too strenuous. During the day, Mao Duo had no choice but to get angry and bask in the sun. Sometimes I gently sneak up next to him and look at him with timid eyes, intending to beg him for forgiveness. His face was gloomy. When he saw me, he told me about the past. I felt that I had no strength. As long as I slept on a hard board at night, when I woke up, I could carry the millet and run upstairs. His sleeping place was upstairs in the toilet room, with a door panel molded in. However, Mao Duo found it comfortable. He casually took off his apron and got in without taking off his clothes or lighting a lamp. He lay down and fell asleep. Cooked. He didn't like sleeping on the cot, so he never went home, even though he also had a wife. His wife came to my house when she wanted money. She couldn't get it from him, so she had to complain to my grandfather. She is a short woman, not very ugly, but she is a little red. According to my old mother, she quietly told me that she had a mistress and had a child. Of course, she had never been home before, and I don't know how the child came about, but now that she has given birth, Mao Price also liked it, and made an exception to go home often during the confinement period. Unfortunately, the child died soon after, and his concubine often cried bitterly, causing eyelid problems. The concubine finally didn't want her anymore, so she often came to my house to harass her. My grandparents often persuaded him to return home. From the beginning, we went to stay at home, but Mao Guy insisted that he would not let the woman ruin his body. He had to do a job. Naturally, I worked to make money, but he doesn't know how to spend it himself. Every year at the end of the year, my grandfather always reminds him, "Mao guy, you have made some money. What do you want to buy?" But he always shook his head and said he couldn't think of it. Just when someone borrowed money from him and promised a huge profit, he found it very interesting. He gave the money to him and never asked for it back, because everyone knew his weakness. When he came to beg for help, he would just say with a straight face, "Isn't this going to cost me my life? I don't have any money, so if you want it, just take my life." Then he was stunned. He quickly comforted others and sometimes lent him more, explaining that he would pay them back together later. There are also people who are more soft-hearted and can't bear to bully him too much, so they ask their children to bring a few kilograms, paid the boy to peel it slowly, eat and drink it. He feels so sorry that he can't ask for money without pushing back. Sometimes I even hate myself for not being able to give him more. Eating and drinking is the greatest joy of gross price. With a big glass of wine and a big piece of meat, he seems to be in a state of ecstasy. Grandfather ordered the orders for others, bowed to advance and retreat. But he couldn't see any of them because he was eating and drinking to have a good time. After drinking enough wine, he just returned to the boat and fell asleep. They gave him 4 oranges to quench his thirst, but he ignored them and put them in his arms and forgot about them. It wasn't until his grandfather played and beat them to get them off the boat that he opened his eyes. He was holding onto the oar and standing swaying. His grandfather had no choice but to get on the boat and use his cane to help push him to the shore. As the boat floated to the middle of the river, Mao's body was shaky, and his grandfather whispered to him to hold the oar carefully and not to drop it in the middle of the river. That day I didn't see my grandfather back until dusk. My grandmother was so anxious that she couldn't sit still. She wanted to ask me to go to the river to see him again and again, but she was also afraid that I was sick and might be blown away by the wind. This was no fun. As for me, I felt uneasy even while sleeping in bed. I wanted to ask my grandmother several times if she had given the white cloth to the hair boy to take with her, but I was probably disappointed, so I had better go and see for myself. "I want to go to the river." I struggled to get up and said to my grandmother, but my grandmother panicked. "Are you talking in your sleep?" "No, I want to go to the river." Seeing that my grandmother couldn't resist me, she said that she would have to accompany me out. I was shocked, except for Ginning. She rarely left the house. This time, she was anxious because she was worried that something might happen to my grandfather, so she didn't hesitate to show her face outside. But that didn't matter to her. We still put on more clothes, and the grandfather and grandson went out hand in hand. The sky gradually darkened, the leaves in the distance became blurred, and gradually even the branches could not be seen clearly, and the tree trunks looked like black shadows. The water in the river was also quiet and seemed deeper and darker, which made people scared. "Could it be they?" Grandma said in a shuddering voice, and I couldn't help but panic. There was no movement in the river, so naturally there would be no boats crossing the bridge. I stared at it blankly, my eyes gradually widening, not even daring to blink. I just hoped that it would suddenly frown, which would be a good sign. "Grandpa, the same gross price is back. The tears are coming." Grandma suddenly patted me on the shoulder and said, I couldn't believe it, and slowly raised my head. But no, I saw my grandfather on the other side of the bridge struggling to help Mao Duo come up. I couldn't help but cheered and ran straight to meet him. In the past, Mao Duo swung his body and sat on the bridge railing. "Orange!" I just stumbled out of my arms. I was overjoyed. It turned out that he was drunk and couldn't even hold the boat, so his grandfather had to help him hard. When he entered the mouth of the river, he saw that he could no longer hold the oar. His grandfather could not punt the boat, so he had to abandon the boat and go to the shore, supporting him and walking home slowly. Now, thank God, we finally reached the copper smelting bridge. At this time, my grandmother couldn't care less about avoiding suspicion, and rushed forward to help my grandfather help him stand up again. So the three of them were in front, and I followed behind, holding the orange firmly in my hands. With difficulty but luckily, I left step by step, by the river.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.